My name is David, and I once believed in the sanctity of love. My relationship with Sarah was the kind of romance that people write stories about. We met during our sophomore year of college at a small coffee shop where I worked part-time. She walked in, her laughter echoing like a melody, and I felt something shift in my chest. We spent countless evenings discussing our dreams. She wanted to be a writer, and I aspired to climb the corporate ladder. Our hopes intertwined, and for a long time, we were the perfect team. After graduation, we married in a quaint ceremony surrounded by friends and family. I remember how radiant she looked in her white dress, her smile illuminating the room. We moved into a modest apartment, filled with hopes of building a life together. Our weekends were spent exploring new restaurants, binge-watching shows, and dreaming about future adventures. I thought we had it all, a strong bond built on trust, love, and shared ambitions. But as time passed, the pressures of work and life began to take their toll. The initial spark faded into routine, and I often found myself preoccupied with my job. I thought Sarah understood. I believed we could navigate through the rough patches together. I didn't realize until much later that while I was chasing my career, she felt increasingly isolated. I began to notice subtle changes in her, the late-night phone calls, the increasingly frequent outings with friends, and the secretive glances she would cast at her phone. Yet I brushed these aside, convincing myself that they were mere figments of my imagination. I trusted her completely. After all, she was my partner, my confidant. How could I suspect her of anything less than loyalty? Everything changed one fateful evening. I returned home earlier than usual, feeling a rare sense of excitement to surprise her. As I walked through the door, I was greeted by an eerie silence. The house was dimly lit, and Sarah was nowhere to be found. I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned to her phone, which lay on the coffee table, buzzing incessantly with notifications. Out of curiosity and a growing sense of dread, I picked it up. I shouldn't have done it, but I found myself scrolling through her messages. It was there, plain as day, messages to a man I didn't recognize, filled with flirtation and intimacy that made my stomach churn. My heart raced as I read the words, each one a dagger to my chest. I felt nauseous, my mind racing with disbelief. How could this be happening? When she finally returned home, I confronted her. The moment I spoke the words, "I saw your messages," I could see the color drain from her face. The shock in her eyes quickly morphed into a defensive stance. She didn't deny it. Instead, she tried to explain. I wanted to scream, to shake her until the truth came out, but instead I stood there, frozen in a mix of anger and heartbreak. "David, I can explain," she said, her voice trembling. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of betrayal and sorrow flooding my veins. How could she think there was any justification for what she had done? I wanted to hear her out, but I also wanted to run. I was a man betrayed, left to grapple with the shattering reality of my life. Her words tumbled out, excuses mingling with tears. She spoke of loneliness, of feeling neglected, of wanting to be desired again. Each justification felt like a slap to my face, further entrenching the betrayal in my heart. I had never felt so powerless, so lost. The woman I loved had shattered the very foundation of our marriage, and there I stood, grappling with the reality that my life was about to change forever. As I walked away from that conversation, I realized I had a choice to make. I could either let her explanation linger and fester or confront the situation head-on. The fire of betrayal ignited a dark resolve within me. I had trusted her unconditionally, and now I felt like a fool. There was no going back from this. I needed to prepare for what came next. The days that followed my confrontation with Sarah were a blur of emotions. I oscillated between anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. I couldn't escape the reality of her infidelity, and every moment felt like a fresh wound. I worked through my thoughts, often replaying our last conversation in my mind, searching for some semblance of understanding. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was no justification for what she had done. I found myself spiraling into a dark place. I had trusted her completely, and now that trust lay shattered at my feet. I started to notice the little things that had changed in our relationship, the subtle signs I had previously ignored. The late-night phone calls, the sudden need for girls' nights, and her growing distance from me now seemed like glaring red flags. I felt like a fool, and the anger I had for her soon turned inward, morphing into self-doubt. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I made a decision. I would not let her betrayal define me. I needed to take control of my life again. One way to do that was to seek legal advice. I wanted to understand my options, to figure out how to navigate this painful chapter. I found a lawyer who specialized in divorce cases, someone who could guide me through the murky waters ahead. Sitting in the lawyer's office, I felt a mix of apprehension and resolve. As I recounted my story, I was surprised at how easily the words flowed. The lawyer listened intently, taking notes as I described the affair, the emotional turmoil, and my desire to move forward. She explained the legal implications of infidelity and what I could pursue in terms of separation and divorce. Infidelity can impact the proceedings, especially when it comes to asset division and alimony, she said, her voice steady and professional. I felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps I could hold Sarah accountable for her actions. I wanted her to understand that there were consequences for betrayal, that she couldn't just walk away unscathed. As I left the office, I felt a sense of purpose settling in. I began to gather evidence, text messages, emails, anything that would paint a clear picture of her betrayal. I found myself poring over documents late into the night, a mix of determination and anger driving me. I felt like I was preparing for battle, ready to fight for my dignity and my future. In the following days, I took the time to reflect on my feelings. I realized that my anger towards her was not just about the affair. It was about the trust that had been broken, the love that felt so genuine now tainted by deceit. I had given her my heart, and she had tossed it aside like it meant nothing. I felt lost and betrayed, but I also felt stronger than I had in weeks. I started to distance myself emotionally from Sarah. I didn't want to feel the pain of her betrayal every time I looked at her. I began to focus on myself, rediscovering hobbies I had neglected and reconnecting with friends I had lost touch with. I realized that while she had shattered our dreams, I still had the power to rebuild my life. When the day of our first court appearance arrived, I felt a mix of anxiety and resolve. I had spent hours preparing my statements, rehearsing what I would say. I wanted to ensure that the judge understood the depth of my pain and the reality of Sarah's actions. I felt a bittersweet sense of anticipation. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I could reclaim my life. As I sat in the courtroom, waiting for the proceedings to begin, I reflected on everything that had led me to this moment. The love I once had for Sarah now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a cold sense of betrayal. I could hear the murmurs of other cases around me, but all I could focus on was the reality of my own. When Sarah walked in, my heart raced. She seemed composed, her eyes scanning the room before settling on me. I felt a surge of anger at the sight of her, and I reminded myself that I was no longer the man who would let her actions define my worth. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. As the proceedings began, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. I knew I had to present my case clearly and unemotionally. I was here to seek justice, to hold her accountable for the choices she made. I was ready to face the storm that lay ahead. The courtroom was a stark, sterile environment, filled with the weight of countless stories of heartache and resolution. As I sat there, my heart pounding, I couldn't help but reflect on how my life had taken such a drastic turn. This was no longer just about love lost. It was about accountability and the pursuit of justice. I was determined to make Sarah face the consequences of her actions, to ensure that she didn't walk away unscathed. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, took his seat and surveyed the room. My palms were clammy as I sat waiting for my turn to speak. I could feel Sarah's eyes on me, a mixture of defiance and guilt etched across her face. She had put on a brave front, dressed impeccably, but I could see the cracks forming beneath her composed exterior. I wanted to confront her, to challenge her justifications, but I knew that this was not the place for emotional outbursts. I had to remain focused. The proceedings began with the judge addressing us both. "You are here today to discuss the matters surrounding the dissolution of your marriage. Mr. Thompson, you may present your case." My heart raced as I stood up, my mind swirling with everything I wanted to say. I had practiced my speech countless times, but now, standing in front of the judge, everything felt surreal. I took a deep breath and began. "Your Honor, I stand before you today not just as a husband, but as a man who has been deeply wronged. I loved my wife, Sarah, with everything I had. We built a life together, filled with dreams and aspirations. But that life was shattered when I discovered her infidelity." My voice trembled slightly, but I pressed on, fueled by the pain I had endured. I recounted the details of my discovery, the late-night messages, the emotional betrayal, and the subsequent confrontation. I wanted the judge to understand the emotional toll her actions had taken on me. As I spoke, I could see Sarah's expression shift, a flicker of regret crossing her face. For a moment, I felt vindicated, but I quickly reminded myself that this was about more than just her feelings. Sarah attempted to justify her affair. I continued, claiming she felt neglected and alone. "While I understand that our marriage had its challenges, I do not believe that infidelity is ever a justified response. Her actions have not only hurt me but have also disrupted our lives." I could feel the weight of my words hanging in the air, and I pressed on, determined to make my case. As I spoke, I caught glimpses of Sarah's eyes, and I could see the emotions swirling within her. I wanted her to feel the gravity of what she had done. I wanted her to know that her choices had consequences, and I was here to ensure that she faced them. I felt a rush of power in that moment, a sense that I was reclaiming my narrative. The judge listened attentively, nodding occasionally as I laid out my case. I could see him processing my words, weighing the emotional impact against the legal implications. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "do you have any evidence to support your claims?" I nodded, my heart pounding as I handed over the printed messages and emails I had collected. As the judge reviewed the evidence, I glanced at Sarah. She looked pale, her bravado fading as the reality of the situation sunk in. I felt a mix of pity and anger. This was the woman I once loved, the woman I had trusted with my heart. Yet here she was, facing the consequences of her own choices. When the judge turned his attention back to us, he addressed Sarah directly. "Mrs. Thompson, do you wish to respond to your husband's claims?" I watched as she took a deep breath, her eyes welling with tears. I was curious to hear what she would say, but I felt an edge of apprehension. Would she take responsibility or attempt to deflect? She began, her voice shaky. "I never meant for any of this to happen." There it was, the familiar refrain of regret. I clenched my fists, willing myself to remain calm. I felt lost, and I made a terrible mistake. I thought I could find solace in someone else. Her words were laced with emotion, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still trying to justify her actions, to paint herself as a victim of circumstance. "I understand that I hurt David," she continued, her voice breaking, "but I was struggling. I thought I could find a way to cope with my feelings of loneliness." I felt a wave of anger wash over me. How could she still be framing this as something beyond her control? This was a choice she had made, and I was tired of her attempting to twist the narrative. The judge listened patiently, but I could see the flicker of skepticism in his eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, while I acknowledge your feelings, it is essential to understand that actions have consequences. Infidelity does not merely impact the individuals involved. It affects the entire structure of a marriage." With those words, I felt a sense of validation. The judge was recognizing the severity of her actions, and it filled me with a renewed sense of hope. This was not just about my pain. It was about ensuring that the truth prevailed in the eyes of the law. I was ready to see this through, to fight for my dignity, and to make sure Sarah understood the gravity of her betrayal. As the proceedings continued, I realized that this was just the beginning. I had a long road ahead, but I was determined to reclaim my life and find justice for the love that had been lost. I wanted closure, and I was willing to fight for it. The courtroom proceedings unfolded like a tense drama, each moment charged with emotion and the weight of my past. After Sarah's initial response, the judge turned to me again, inviting me to elaborate. I took a deep breath, feeling like I was standing at the edge of a precipice, ready to leap into the unknown. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady but filled with the remnants of pain, "I want to emphasize that this is not just about the affair. It's about the trust that was shattered, the life we built together that has been reduced to ashes. We had plans for a future that now feels like a cruel joke." I could see the judge nodding, as if he understood the gravity of my words. Sarah and I were supposed to be partners in every sense. We shared dreams, laughter, and the mundane moments that make up a life together. I can't express how deeply it hurts to realize that she was sharing those same moments with someone else. My voice cracked slightly, and I felt the sting of tears in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. As I continued, I felt the anger within me morphing into a fierce determination. I loved her unconditionally, and I believed she loved me in return. But her actions have shown me that love can be weaponized. It can be twisted into something unrecognizable. I stand here not just as a victim, but as a man who is reclaiming his dignity. I watched Sarah's expression change as I spoke. She looked pained, and for a moment I wondered if she felt any remorse for what she had done. But then I remembered her earlier justifications and felt a surge of anger again. I had to remain resolute. This was about my healing, my journey, and I would not allow her to manipulate my feelings any longer. The judge then turned to the evidence I had submitted. "Mr. Thompson, these messages you provided, can you explain their relevance to the court?" I nodded, eager to illustrate the depth of Sarah's betrayal. "These exchanges show not just infidelity, but an emotional disconnect that spiraled into something far more damaging. They reveal a pattern of deceit that ultimately led to the destruction of our marriage." As I pointed out specific messages, I felt a sense of vindication. Each word I read aloud was a reminder of the trust she had broken. I could see the judge's expression harden as the reality of Sarah's actions became clear. This was no longer just a personal issue between us. It had become a matter of legal accountability. "Your Honor," I continued, "I believe it's important for the court to understand that Sarah's actions have not only hurt me emotionally, but have also impacted our financial stability. We made joint decisions, and her betrayal has consequences that extend beyond our relationship." I mentioned the financial implications of the affair, the potential for emotional distress claims, and how her actions had disrupted the balance we had worked so hard to establish. As I spoke, I felt empowered. I was no longer the man who had been blindsided by betrayal. I was a man standing firm in his truth, ready to reclaim his life. I could see the judge taking notes, his brow furrowing as he processed the evidence and my testimony. I hoped he could see the sincerity of my pain and the reality of my situation. When I finished, the judge turned to Sarah once more. "Mrs. Thompson, do you wish to respond to your husband's claims regarding the emotional and financial impact of your actions?" I held my breath, waiting for her response. Would she take responsibility, or would she continue to deflect? "I understand that I hurt David," she said, her voice shaky. "But I never intended for it to escalate to this point. I thought I could handle it without causing any harm." Her words felt hollow to me, like an empty attempt to excuse the inexcusable. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her how naive she was to think that her actions wouldn't have consequences. "Your Honor," I interjected, feeling the need to clarify, "there's a difference between handling personal issues and engaging in an affair. This was not a moment of weakness. It was a conscious choice that she made repeatedly." The judge nodded, acknowledging my point. As the proceedings continued, I could feel the tension in the air, a thick layer of unresolved emotions hanging over us. It was clear that the judge was growing weary of the back-and-forth justifications. He seemed eager to move toward a resolution, and I found myself hoping that this would be the turning point for me. After what felt like hours, the judge called for a recess. I stepped out of the courtroom, my heart racing. I needed air, space to collect my thoughts. I felt a mix of adrenaline and anxiety coursing through my veins. As I leaned against the cool wall of the courthouse, I reflected on everything that had transpired. I had faced Sarah and her justifications head-on, and I felt a sense of accomplishment in my resolve. But the journey was far from over. I knew we would have to return to court to discuss the financial aspects of our divorce, the division of assets, and the potential for alimony. I was prepared to fight for what was rightfully mine, to ensure that her betrayal had consequences beyond just the emotional scars. As I re-entered the courtroom, I steeled myself for what lay ahead. I was ready to confront the reality of our marriage's end, to seek justice for the love I had lost, and to reclaim my life. The courtroom resumed its tense atmosphere as we settled back into our seats. The judge, having taken a moment to gather his thoughts, seemed more focused than ever. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. This was not just about the emotional fallout. It was about the financial repercussions of Sarah's choices and ensuring that I was not left to pick up the pieces alone. The judge began by addressing the financial implications of our divorce. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "I understand that you wish to discuss the division of assets and the potential for alimony. Please proceed." My heart raced as I prepared to present my case. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the opportunity to ensure that Sarah faced the consequences of her actions in a tangible way. "Your Honor," I started, my voice steady, "I believe it's crucial to consider the financial impact of Sarah's infidelity on our marriage. We had built a life together, with shared savings and investments. I worked hard to provide for us, and her actions have not only hurt me emotionally but have also disrupted our financial stability." I laid out the facts, our joint accounts, the investments we had made together, and the plans we had for the future. I wanted to make it clear that this was not just a matter of emotional betrayal. It had serious financial consequences that needed to be addressed. I could feel the judge's attention sharpening as I spoke, and I pressed on, determined to make my case compelling. "Furthermore, I have evidence of Sarah's spending habits during the time of her affair," I continued, presenting documents that showed unusual withdrawals and purchases that seemed inconsistent with our financial situation. "This indicates that not only was she emotionally unfaithful, but she was also financially irresponsible during this time. I believe it demonstrates a disregard for our shared financial goals." The judge reviewed the documents, his brow furrowing as he took in the implications of what I was presenting. I felt a surge of hope. Perhaps this would be the turning point I needed to ensure that Sarah was held accountable. "Mrs. Thompson," the judge said, turning to Sarah, "do you have any response to your husband's claims regarding the financial implications of your actions?" I watched as she shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable under the scrutiny. I didn't realize how much my actions were affecting our finances," she stammered, her voice shaky. "I was caught up in a moment of weakness, and I didn't think about the consequences." I clenched my jaw, feeling the anger bubbling inside me again. Her words felt like a feeble attempt to deflect responsibility. "Your Honor," I interjected, "this isn't just about a moment of weakness. This is about a pattern of behavior that indicates a lack of respect for our marriage and the financial commitments we made to each other. I believe that her actions should have a direct impact on the division of our assets." The judge nodded, acknowledging my point. It is important to understand that actions have consequences, both emotionally and financially. I will take this into consideration as we move forward. As the session continued, we delved deeper into the specifics of our financial situation. I presented evidence of our joint savings, retirement accounts, and property ownership. I wanted to ensure that Sarah understood the gravity of her actions and how they had disrupted everything we had built together. Throughout the proceedings, Sarah's demeanor shifted. She went from defiant to defensive, and I could see the realization dawning on her that her choices had not only hurt me but could also have lasting repercussions on her financial future. I felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. This was what I wanted, to see her face the consequences of her betrayal, but it also made me acutely aware of the life we had lost. The judge asked pointed questions, seeking clarity on various financial aspects, and I answered each one with conviction. I wanted to make it clear that I was not seeking revenge. I was simply seeking justice. I deserved to be compensated for the emotional turmoil and the disruption of our shared life. As the session progressed, it became evident that the judge was leaning toward a fair division of assets. I felt a sense of triumph as I realized that my efforts to present a solid case were paying off. I could see Sarah's confidence waning, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that I would emerge from this ordeal with my dignity intact. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge announced a brief recess to consider the evidence presented. As we stood up, I glanced over at Sarah. She looked defeated, her eyes downcast. I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a sense of closure beginning to take shape. During the break, I stepped outside the courtroom, needing to clear my mind. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on me. I had fought hard for my dignity and my future, and now it felt like I was on the brink of a new beginning. When we returned, the judge was ready to deliver his decision. I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach as I sat down, my heart racing. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment that would determine the course of my life moving forward. Having reviewed the evidence and testimony presented by both parties, the judge began, "I find that Mrs. Thompson's actions have indeed had a significant impact on the marriage and the financial situation of both parties involved." My heart raced as I listened intently, hoping for the outcome I desired. The court will award a fair division of assets, taking into account the emotional distress caused by infidelity. Additionally, Mr. Thompson will receive alimony for a specified period to assist in his transition to a new chapter in life. The words washed over me like a wave, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. Justice had been served, and I could finally see a path forward. I glanced at Sarah, whose face had turned pale. In that moment, I felt a bittersweet satisfaction. She would have to face the consequences of her choices, and I would no longer be the man left picking up the pieces. As the judge wrapped up the proceedings, I felt a sense of closure beginning to settle in. I had faced my fears, confronted the betrayal head-on, and emerged stronger than ever. The road ahead would not be easy, but I was ready to reclaim my life and build a future free from the shadows of my past. As the judge's gavel struck the desk, signaling the end of the proceedings, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. The courtroom, once a place of anguish and betrayal, had transformed into a space of liberation. I had faced Sarah, confronted the reality of our marriage, and emerged with a sense of justice that seemed almost surreal. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from my shoulders. The world outside was bright, the sun shining down, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope. I had endured the pain of betrayal, but now I was ready to embrace a new beginning. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air. I had a long journey ahead, but I was determined to rebuild my life. I had spent too long in the shadows of Sarah's actions, and now it was time to focus on myself. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a desire to rediscover who I was outside of our marriage. In the weeks that followed the court proceedings, I began to embrace a new routine. I reconnected with friends I had neglected during my marriage, and they welcomed me back with open arms. I found solace in their company, sharing stories, laughter, and moments of vulnerability. It was refreshing to engage with people who reminded me of the joy that existed outside the confines of my past. I also took time to reflect on my own needs and desires. I started pursuing hobbies that had long been sidelined: photography, hiking, and even cooking. Each new experience felt like a step towards healing, a way to reclaim the pieces of myself that had been lost in the turbulence of my marriage. But as I moved forward, I couldn't ignore the emotional scars that lingered. There were nights when I would lie awake, memories of Sarah flooding my mind. I would replay our moments together, the laughter, the love, and then the betrayal. It was a complicated mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of loss. I sought therapy to help navigate these feelings, to process the pain and learn how to forgive, not just Sarah, but myself. In therapy, I began to understand that forgiveness didn't mean condoning her actions. It meant freeing myself from the chains of resentment that had held me captive for too long. I learned to acknowledge my feelings, to sit with the discomfort, and slowly I started to let go. It was a gradual process, but with each session I felt a little lighter, a little more at peace. Months passed, and I found myself in a much healthier place. I had moved on from the bitterness of betrayal and was beginning to embrace the possibilities of the future. I focused on personal growth, setting new goals, and even exploring new relationships. I learned to trust again, albeit cautiously, and I found joy in the simple moments, dining with friends, exploring new places, and even finding humor in life's unpredictability. Then one evening I received a message from Sarah. My heart raced as I read her words, a mixture of apprehension and curiosity flooding my mind. She wanted to meet to talk about everything that had happened. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to revisit the past, but part of me felt that I owed it to myself to hear her out. When we finally met, I felt a swirl of emotions. Sarah looked different, vulnerable and remorseful. As we sat across from each other, I could see the weight of regret etched on her face. We talked about the affair, the pain it had caused, and how it had changed both of us. I listened intently as she expressed her remorse, her understanding of the hurt she had inflicted, and I found myself reflecting on how far I had come. "I know I can never take back what I did," she said, tears in her eyes, "but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." I felt a rush of emotions, anger, hurt, but also a sense of closure. I realized that while I had been deeply wounded, I had also grown immensely from the experience. "I appreciate your honesty, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "But forgiveness doesn't mean we go back to what we had. I've learned to value myself more, and I need to prioritize my own happiness." It was liberating to say those words, to assert my boundaries and acknowledge my growth. With that conversation, I felt a sense of closure settling in. I knew that I could move forward without the burden of resentment weighing me down. I had faced my past, confronted my pain, and emerged stronger. As I walked away from that meeting, I felt a renewed sense of freedom. I was no longer defined by Sarah's betrayal. I was David, a man who had endured and risen above the ashes of a broken relationship. I had learned valuable lessons about love, trust, and the importance of prioritizing my own well-being. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was ready to embrace whatever came next. I had survived the storm, and now it was time to enjoy the sunshine. I was ready to live fully, to love openly, and to embrace the beauty of life once again. And as I stepped into the future, I knew that I was finally free.